Our final award this evening is the Passionistas Persist Humanitarian Award, which honors a woman who spends her days in pursuit of equal rights and promoting human welfare for all people. The award is being presented by Kara Reedy, a journalist, actor, director, and photographer. As the director of the Disabled Journalists Association, Kara knows that the world is missing out on some of the best stories on the planet, and the journalist in her knows that can't stand.
I met Rebecca 3 years ago when I was interviewing her for a documentary I was working on at The Guardian. Literally, the moment we clapped eyes on each other, she screamed, "You don't get down with that LPA bullshit either." I knew we would be friends immediately. Rebecca is a second-generation activist. She's been around since she could ride on her godmother's wheelchair to protests. She was the co-founder and director of the Disability Justice Initiative at Center for American Progress, where she built out a progressive policy platform that protected the rights and services disabled people depend on for survival, and also developed innovative solutions like a proposed disabled worker tax credit and increased access to capital for disability-owned small businesses. She stewarded a campaign that resulted in an unprecedented 12 presidential candidates developing disability policy platforms. She's a 3-time presidential appointee. Rebecca served in key policy roles at the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as oversaw diversity and inclusion efforts for the Obama administration. I'm honored to present her with the Passionistas Persist Humanitarian Award.
Thank you so much, Kara. It is such a tremendous honor to accept the 2022 Passionistas Persist Humanitarian Award. 43 years ago, my parents, both people with dwarfism, recorded an interview for a local news station where they said that they hoped for a future for their child where people with dwarfism would not be jokes, could achieve any job they desired, and live a life free from discrimination. Their work as activists and advocates paved the road that led me to youth leadership programs, to the University of California, Santa Cruz, Go Banana Slugs, the White House, numerous campaigns, and today at the Ford Foundation. As the mom of 3, I find myself honestly wishing the same thing for my children today, 43 years later. If there was anything I learned from my mom, a single mom, who became a single mom when my dad left us after she got accepted into college, was a lesson in persistence. Sometimes the only way out is through. And in troubling times like these, there is no one else I would rather be in the trenches with, working our way through all of this hot mess, than all of you fellow Passionistas. Thank you again for this tremendous honor.
I always like to think about like how people grew up, and like I grew up in a house full of Black people because we're Black that persisted through the civil rights movement, but I didn't have a full understanding of like disability as an identity, how they intersect. Just I was a little behind kind of in my understanding of disability and oppression. How do you feel like you being a second generation activist in this space has prepared you to attack the problems of oppression of disabled people? How did your understanding of your oppression as a child lead you to this, and having your parents kind of lead you to it?
My parents never hesitated to talk about either our oppression that we faced as people with dwarfism or the privilege that we face. And, you see, I have a Good Trouble banner up in the background. My dad was the son of a federal judge in Selma, Alabama. I have no problem using the term a white supremacist federal judge in Selma, Alabama, who routinely threw freedom riders in jail, who oversaw the travesty that was the Reverend James Reeb trial, and who filed an injunction that made it a violation of the law for 3 or more African Americans to congregate in Selma and talk about voting. And that history was never hidden from me. My parents were very open in talking about how my dad was raised, how he was brought up, his parents and siblings' perception of the world and their place in it. And, for my dad, yes, he was, the younger son of this big time jackass of a judge. But my dad was also the only little person in his family. And so, wherever they went, yes, he was the judge's kid, but he was also the dwarf. And his older brother had schizophrenia. So in a very Southern, very patriarchal family, both sons were disabled. And I think that was something that was never lost on my dad. His brother became institutionalized when my dad was a teenager, and his brother was in his early 20s. And so while, yes, he grew up with a lot of privilege, he also grew up with a brother that, nobody talked about. And then he was the heir, or, you had the heir and the spare, if we're going to, use a monarchy term. And the spare was a little person. And so, my dad spent a lot of time thinking about what his life was like. And my dad grew up with gay friends in Alabama and saw how they were treated, and ended up at a little people convention where he met my mom, who was the number 5 of 9 kids, all red-haired flower children. And it was love at first sight. My dad went home to Alabama and packed up his 69 Camaro and drove it from Selma to San Francisco. And they got married like 6 months after my mom turned 18. And my mom was also the only person with dwarfism in her family. And growing up in the Bay Area at the height of the AIDS epidemic, my dad ran a center for independent living. My mom ran a disabled student center at a community college. And so they were losing friends and students and clients left and right. And I remember as a kid, like my parents skipping my ice skating lesson for us to go to funerals. And I remember being like, why are we going to another funeral? And my parents being like, nobody deserves to die alone. Like, we have a responsibility to show up for people. And that was always my parents' core value. And, we would talk about things. Like, I remember when I had the realization that my dad's best friend was gay. And I remember asking my dad, why does Uncle Don's roommate come with us whenever we go anywhere? Like, why does Mark come with us? And my dad was like, well, that's his roommate. And my mom was like, come on, Billy, like, give me a break. And my dad was like, that's his partner. They love each other. And I was 6. And so it was like, oh, they love each other. Okay, that's cool. Like, whatever. So my parents were really open in both talking about sort of the ways they moved about the world, but also the fact that that there was oppression and that we had to talk about it, and that it wasn't always like stiff upper lip or, pick yourself up from the bootstraps. That there are days that it really sucks being a disabled person. And they didn't hide that from me.
You also kind of touched on grief being a really big part of being disabled. I don't say that lightly, but whenever I say this or bring up something that's negative around disability, people are like, we knew it. And it's like, no, you don't really get it. That's not what we mean by that, but there is a level of grief that is involved in being disabled, because the systems let you down so often. How do you navigate your grief to keep moving?
I was in your spot, and I was interviewing Senator Tammy Duckworth when we launched the project that I was running at the time at the Center for American Progress. And I asked her about it as a disabled woman veteran. And she said, Becca, sometimes you just have to embrace the suck. And I thought that phrase was so perfect. And I was like, I've never heard anyone just say it like that. And she's like, yeah, there's days it totally sucks. And there's days that it's really rough. And that's the reality. And we don't do any of us a service by not being willing to talk about that. And I remember coming across a book on dwarfism recently, actually, that had my mom's story in it. And my mom talked about how when she was 16, my grandpa took her to Muir Woods, just north of San Francisco. And with a family of 9 kids, nobody got alone time with parents. That just doesn't happen. And my grandfather sat in the car with my mom in the Volkswagen Bug that they had and told her she was never going to get any bigger. And her talking about her mourning process. And that wasn't something my parents did for me. And so, there are days when it sucks. I mean, I remember there was a job I really wanted, a vice president for health justice for a progressive women's organization. I was a finalist. And then they called me to tell me I wasn't getting the job. And what they said, and I quote, was, "Our organization is not ambitious enough to hire someone like you." And I was like, what the hell? Like, is that a compliment? Is it an insult? Like, how do I even take that? And I remember being like, oh, okay. Like, you're proud that your organization has such a ass backwards view about the world. And so I think it's just, it doesn't mean you're not proud in who you are. It actually means that you have just, who you are.
Can you talk a little bit about how you've approached kind of building this groundbreaking sort of platform and base?
For so long, the number one thing holding back work in the disability rights and justice space was, we don't have money. And so I remember when I was at the National Council on Disability, actually, no, even before that, I remember when I was working for President Obama, and I needed to find people with disabilities that were experts in housing policy. And I made like 30 calls and I couldn't find anybody. I was just like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Why is there this problem? And, part of the problem is because people with disabilities live in a state of legalized, codified poverty. And so folks don't go to college or can't go to college, can't afford going to college. Or if they go to college, they can't work because if they work, they'll lose their health insurance. And I remember just being like, what would it be like if money wasn't the problem? What could we build? And so I started years ago building this list that was originally entitled Things That We Need. And it was like a cross disability rights community housing portfolio, policy agenda. What do we, what are the issues? What are the problems, et cetera? What else do we need? Why do we keep, I remember saying, why do we keep funding exoskeletons when disabled people by the thousands die every year as a result of bed sores? Jesus, do we need another damn exoskeleton? And why is money going to this? And people are like, oh, the averages and the ables are like, oh, look, it's an exoskeleton, so you can walk too. Yeah, but I'd rather not die of a bed sore. And so I just started building a list. And then when I was asked to apply for the job at Ford, the list became a bit more formal and turned into cool shit I want the Ford Foundation to fund at the back of a notebook. And in it, I'm very specifically laid out, we need a place doing work on immigration reform. We need to fund work supporting Native and Indigenous folks with disabilities. We need a disabled journalists organization. We need we need an organization of disabled doctors, especially during this pandemic. And so much of the health reporting is just so crappy. So if we have good journalists and we have good doctors, that's a package deal. We can move something forward. And I need a disabled economist. I want to be able to break down the numbers so we can actually tell the real story around disability and poverty. And if we're talking about reparations, have we thought about how reparations would impact disabled African Americans? No, we haven't. Well, how do we make sure they don't screw African American disabled folks? And can I get an economist to build out that work? Because I know we're really going to need it, but no one's doing it. And that's the most fun part of the job is sometimes just sitting back and being okay, so if we get this, this, and this, what's the next thing? What would be really cool to do? Who, and also at the same time being at a place like Ford, I joke all the time that when I was at the White House, everyone took my calls. No, 90% of people took my calls. 100% of people take my calls when you give away money. And I was lucky that I had friends that worked in the foundation space that were enjoy it now, because when your time is up, nobody will answer your calls. They're use it. And so continually thinking of what are the spaces we need to be in, and how can I use the privilege that I have in my role at the Ford Foundation to get our people into those spaces and make sure that they're supported in those spaces and that they can thrive in those spaces. Because it's not just getting in the door. Because you can get in the door and then be surrounded by a room full of assholes. But how do we make sure it's the right door? How do we make sure whatever we're funding is set up to thrive? How do we make sure the people on the other end get it and are going to truly welcome and embrace and not just accept, but amplify and support disabled folks and disabled issues in that way?
Your kids are third generation now activists, and they're already like
persistent.
They're persistent, yeah. Which
they're
is persistent. Great. Where do you hope to get the disability rights, civil rights space to hand off to them?
I want them to not have to choose whether they're Black or they're disabled. Like, I want them to be able to walk in a space, whether it be a disability majority space, African American majority space, and be welcomed and celebrated and supported for who they are, regardless of who their mother is and what I had to do to lovingly encourage those organizations to stop being butt heads and let them in. I want them in those places and thriving, you know, if they want to be. I want Kaya to be proud of the fact that Elizabeth Warren made her pinky promise to consider running for president one day, and that Elizabeth Warren called her to ask her about her presidential platform that she had me post on Twitter, you know. And at the same time, if Kaya wants to say, you know what, I want to be a teacher instead, or I want to be a mom. Like, I want those choices to be her choices and not choices she feels are imposed on her or limited by society. And I want Kendrick to feel okay for just being an average, you know. I want good jobs for average kids. Like, light bulb turner is just not good enough. Like, person who hands down stuff to their mom from the top shelf of the grocery store. No, like, he can go to college too. He can do real things.
What does the power of Passionista mean to you?
It's the power of the fight. It's the power of not giving up. It's the power of the possible, the thinking about, in this moment, feeling not excited about the world, but still not losing hope. Like, still having hope that we will get to a place where we can live our fullest lives, bring our whole selves unabashedly and proudly and excitedly to whatever table we go to. Or if we don't like a table, you know what? We pull out a chainsaw, we saw the damn thing down, set it on fire, and we have a campfire. And we set a campfire that we can all bring our whole selves to.
Thank you so much to all of this year's recipients and presenters. These women, all of our participants in this year's summit, and all of you watching are the people who are changing the world, and we are honored to have you as part of the Passionistas community. Have a great night, and we'll see you back here on the main stage tomorrow at noon Eastern, 11 Central, and 9 a.m. Pacific.